Dr. Jonathan Losos from WashU, which is in St. Louis, is going to be talking about natural selection and design.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be here following the great talks we've heard already. Nature is full of just amazing creatures, superbly adapted to where they live. And I think everyone has their own favorites. Mine would be, for example, the cheetah. I'm wearing my cheetah shirt. Able to run 70 miles per hour. Or hummingbirds, able to hover in midair. But then again, there are also incredible organs, such as the eye and the kidneys, composed of so many parts that work together so beautifully. And so the question that I've been assigned to address today is to talk about natural selection and design, explanations for how these complex adaptations have arisen. So my talk will be in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the argument from design, then the theory of evolution by natural selection, then intelligent design, which we've heard about already, and then back to the argument from design again. So let's start at the beginning. There's an idea going back at least to the Greeks 2,000 years ago about how we can explain complex structures. But the person who's usually associated with is William Paley. He was an English Anglican clergyman who lived mostly in the 18th century, and he wrote this book in 1802, which was a bestseller, titled Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearance of Nature. And this book starts, the very beginning, the first paragraph, poses this question, this hypothetical scenario. He says, I'm walking through a heath, and I come across a pocket watch, and I pick it up, and I look at how incredibly complex and intricate it is, all the parts beautifully working together efficiently for the purpose of telling time. And to explain that, he says, the inference is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed an inventor who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. There cannot be design without a designer. And who that designer is? Well, the subtitle of his book makes clear. It's God. So these ideas, I think, reigned supreme for most of 2 millennia until along comes Charles Darwin. And Darwin writes in his autobiography, published after his death, the old argument of design in nature, as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by man. There seems to be no more design in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. So natural selection, in other words, is the explanation for these complex structures. Now, how do they actually work? We're taught that natural selection works when some selective agent, such as an owl, imposes a fitness cost such that one phenotypic variant does better than another, such as the owl picking out the mismatched mice, and so on. This is certainly true, and we have plenty of evidence that natural selection works, but of course this isn't building anything complex, it's just choosing among 2 variants. The eye, the kidney, structures like that are composed of many parts. Undoubtedly, many genes are involved, many mutations. It's not just one selective event. And in fact, what it is, I wrote this down in Sean's talk because he said it perfectly, it is an easier said than done, an iterative process of mutation and selection. In particular, Darwin put forward 2 ideas. One is the idea that a structure gets built step by step, with selection in each case favoring better forms to do the same thing. As, for example, the famous case of the eye. The idea is that every step along the way, the incipient eye structure gets better at seeing. So you can imagine an organism that initially had no visual capabilities whatsoever. If a mutation causes photoreceptors that can detect light to be in the organism, well, that's better than not being able to see light at all. So natural selection would favor that. And then if another mutation comes along that allows there to be some directionality to tell where the light is coming from, well, that's better than no directionality. And then maybe a pinhole camera type eye structure that allows an image, even a crude one, to be formed, that's better than not having that. And so step by step, the eye gets better and better at seeing. And that is how one way in which a complex structure could arise. But there's another way, and we already heard about that in Ken Miller's talk this morning, and that is by natural selection, by the structure being selected for different functions as it becomes more complex. And we already heard examples this morning, but let me give another one, the evolution of flight in birds. Well, we think that the first thing that happened was that proto-feathers appeared that were kind of downy and fluffy, probably useful for insulation. And so natural selection would have favored them for that reason. But once you have these little fluffy structures, you can modify them, give them colors or shapes that could be used for displays, sexual selection, or whatever. And then once those get elaborated to that extent, perhaps they're useful in capturing prey on the ground, little insects that run in front of you and jump up, or lizards or something. And that might lead to a greater elaboration of the forearms and the feathers. In turn, that might lead to gliding ability. And then and that would be favored for yet another function. And finally, once you can glide, why not have mutations to have powered flight? And so the point is that structures can evolve not by getting better and better at the same function, but every new change leading to new opportunities for selection for new functions. So those are the ideas that have been put out and have pretty much been accepted ever since. Now, I do want to point one thing out. And this example I just gave you with the birds and the feathers, we weren't there to see it or to study it. It's a plausible story, but we didn't actually observe the evolution of complex structures, much less measure the selective properties. We do have plenty of fossil evidence for the phenotypic changes that occurred in the skeleton, changing from theropod dinosaurs to the birds we have. Even in the feathers, there's a good sequence. So we know what happened there, but we didn't actually observe the selective pressures. And I'm sure we'll be hearing later in the session this afternoon about how great the fossil record enlightens our understanding of evolutionary history. But we didn't actually measure the selection. And so the question is, can we actually observe and study the evolution of complex adaptations as they evolve? Well, one of the great advances, I think, in all of biology, perhaps all of science in the last 3 or 4 decades, is the realization that we can actually study evolution as it occurs in nature. And I have a picture of Peter Rosemary Grant, who did the fantastic work on the Darwin's finches, but there are many others now. And we have a huge compendium of examples of selection leading to evolutionary change. But still, not very many examples of complex structures being built up, because that does take time and hasn't been observed very often. But there is another place where we can observe such action, and that is in experimental studies of evolution in the laboratory, usually done on organisms with fast life cycles so that many generations can occur very quickly in the lab. And I want to give you one example, and that's an example studying the evolution of multicellularity, one of the great questions in evolutionary biology, which is, how did we get here with our millions and trillions of cells, the cells differentiated to do different things? How did that all evolve from single-celled ancestors? Well, a fabulous research program asking just this question has been conducted using the humble baker's yeast, using a unicellular strain, and subjecting it to the following selection pressure. I should say this work began at the University of Minnesota and is now being carried on at Georgia Tech. And the idea is this. The researchers made a column of liquid, shown there, and they put the yeast cells in the liquid, and they basically took the first ones to get to the bottom and saved them for the next generation and did it over again, selecting for the ones that fall the fastest. And what happened very quickly is that a mutation that affected cell division cropped up. And what happened is normally one cell, as you probably know, splits into 2, and then they bud off, and that's how single-celled organisms often reproduce. But in this case, a mutation occurred that they split into 2, but then they didn't come apart. And so that led to what we see here, a glob of multiple cells stuck together. They're very gelatinous, all the cells were the same, but there were a glob of them. They were heavier, so they fell to the bottom more quickly, and so they were selected for in the experiment. Well, it turns out that after many generations of the same selection pressure, what the researchers found was that the cells actually started not only sticking together, but developing different cell types. There were long, rod-like ones that interwove, giving much greater strength. There were other ones that built cell walls, again giving greater strength, and other sorts of cells. And eventually you had, over a period of just 3,000 generations, a quite complex structure, shown here, about 20,000 times the size of the original structure, much harder than it was, and a complex organism. In other words, shown by this just repeated selection process. So laboratory studies have shown how this can actually occur. And so we do have direct evidence, at least in this context. All right, with that, I want to switch to the discussion of intelligent design. And we've already heard this morning that intelligent design is just Paley's argument of the argument from design repackaged. And we've heard some great critiques of irreducible complexity and so on. I would like to add, though, one other critique of intelligent design. I call it a general problem, and it's really not a very sophisticated one. It's any smart-alecky teenager would have thought this up. But it's something that I think is worth presenting. And let's go back to Paley, the idea you find the stopwatch, it's so beautifully adapted to telling time, so intricate, must be a designer, he argues. Well, what if you found this Rube Goldberg type structure? This is actually a Rube Goldberg cartoon, a contraption with all these crazy connections. It manages to tell time, but what kind of intelligent designer would do that? If you found this, what would your conclusion be? That the designer is not so intelligent? That the designer has good days and bad days? Or maybe there's no designer at all? Well, in other words, what about unintelligent design? And the fact is that nature is full of things that are not designed intelligently. For example, the giraffe. Let's focus on the nerves that go from the larynx to the brain. Now, and so they're shown here. Let's see if I can get this. All right, what do I push here? I knew that would happen. Forget it. Here we go. You've got the superior larynx, which goes from the head exactly what you'd expect, a few inches up to the brain. That makes sense. But you have the inferior laryngeal nerve that goes all the way down the neck, loops underneath an aortic arch, and goes all the way back up. 15 feet long just to send a message to the brain a few inches away. What kind of intelligent designer would produce that? But when we look at evolutionary history, it actually makes perfect sense that the early ancestor of vertebrates, this fish-like organism on the left side there was no neck, and the throat and the brain were very close to each other. But then as organisms evolved, and it loops underneath the aortic, the nerve loops underneath the aortic arch. But as necks develop and the distance between the brain and the throat, so on, gets larger and gets pulled down into the chest of the heart, well, the nerve just goes down there with the aortic vessel. And so even for us, we have the same thing as the giraffe. It's not 15 feet, but it's long. And then you end up with the giraffe. So the point is, evolutionary history explains how this could be, but certainly no intelligent designer would have produced it. There are plenty of examples like this. We just need to look at our backs, which those of you who have back problems know, not well designed. It makes sense when you realize we are evolved from quadrupedal ancestors. Or one more example, the appendix, a small offshoot of the large intestine. As you know, it can get infected and can cause a serious illness, can be even fatal if not treated. Again, intelligent design? I don't think so. But it turns out that other mammals that are herbivorous have a much larger and important organ of digestion, especially for vegetation. Presumably what we have is just what's left over from our ancestors. Now I will say we used to think that the appendix had no purpose, did nothing good at all. We now know that doesn't seem to be correct, that the appendix does serve as a reservoir for the intestinal microbe flora, the microbiome, such that if you lose your microbiome due to dysentery or antibiotics, it can replenish it. But still, what kind of an intelligent designer would create a structure like this, so prone to dangerous disease, to illness, for this purpose? So, unintelligent design would seem to be a problem. Finally, I want to return to the argument from design to make one more point. And that is, Paley had in the 11th edition of Natural Theology, there was a little known postscript that goes like this. While walking on a barren moor in Tibet, I came across another timepiece, clearly distinct from the one on the beach, on the heath back home, yet constructed very similarly. one could but surmise that the designer, having developed a perfect contrivance, had repeatedly made use of the same design to construct instruments of the same purpose. In other words, finding a Chinese-made pocket watch, very similar to the English one, clearly different in some of the details, but essentially the same design. And in fact, nature is full of such examples of the designer, the creator repeating his design. Fast-swimming marine organisms have streamlined body shapes, have skin that has features that minimize friction and drag, and have a powerful tail for swimming. Nectar-feeding birds on multiple continents around the world have long beaks that reach perfectly inside the flowers. On at least 3 continents in the world, desert rodents have elongate legs and hop bipedally, which is very efficient to move over open sandy areas. In the plant realm, cactus in the New World are paralleled by similar plants in the Old World, green skin with the photosynthesis going on there, no leaves, and so on. So this certainly would make sense that if a creator came up with a good design, the creator would reuse it. But of course, Darwin had a different idea. He said, for animals belonging to 2 most distinct lines of descent may readily become adapted to similar conditions and thus assume a close external resemblance. In other words, what we know today as convergent evolution. Species evolving the same features, often occurring in similar environments and presumably adapting in the same way. There was a time when we thought convergent evolution was not common, and so every new example was treated as, oh, what an amazing new discovery. We now know that's wrong. In fact, in recent years, there have been multiple thick compendia of just lists, case after case of convergent evolution. We now understand it's very common. Many people consider it to be the expected result, and that it may well be, according to some people, ubiquitous. Now, I do want to point out that my example, the little-known postscript, I actually made it up. I just thought it seemed like a reasonable argument. But then I thought to myself, why haven't the creationists come up with this argument? Well, it turns out they have. Answers in Genesis says, the world is filled with astonishing examples of similar designs among unrelated creatures. Some people claim this is evidence of the power of evolution, but from a biblical perspective, the astonishing similarity of designs among unrelated creatures is powerful evidence of a common designer. So, convergent evolution could also just be more evidence for the creator. How do we tell the difference? I think the argument would be the same as with unintelligent design. Instances in which we can easily explain due to evolution and looking at history, but otherwise make no sense. In particular, I want to point out to the exceptions, if they are exceptions to convergent evolution, organisms that are extremely well adapted to where they live, their environment occurs in other places, and yet organisms haven't evolved the same convergent solutions. And it turns out that these evolutionary singletons or evolutionary one-offs are quite common. And so I want to give you just a few examples. Let's go down first to Australia, the place where just about everything is a little bit different. The dominant grazers there don't look like deer or bison or wildebeest. They're kangaroos. They hop around on 2 legs, unlike herbivores anywhere else in the world. There's the koala. There's no animal like it anywhere. It lives on eucalyptus trees, eats the leaves that are full of toxins, and as a result has a very slow lifestyle. And then there's the greatest animal ever in the world, the duck-billed platypus. Exquisitely adapted to live in cold creeks and streams. Now, the sort of habitats it lives in occurs all over the world. We had one behind my house growing up. I didn't have a duck-billed platypus. It hasn't evolved anywhere else, only in Australia. Or we can go next door to New Zealand, that place of which there are no terrestrial mammals, and so flying organisms have taken over. One of the most common insectivores shuffling through the leaf litter is not a shrew or a hedgehog, it's a kiwi, which uses its bill to poke around to find worms and little bugs. There's a flightless parrot that walks up to the top of trees to get the nuts. But my favorite example is the New Zealand short-tailed bat, and I'm going to let David Attenborough explain it to us.
They land on the ground and forage through the leaf litter just like shrews. They're walking on their wrists, with the bones of their fingers pointing upwards and slotted into a groove along the upper arm.
Imagine that, a bat walking around foraging on its wrists. only in New Zealand. In fact, these evolutionary one-offs occur all over the world, often on islands. There's the giant earwig of St. Helena. There's the Selenodon of Hispaniola. The flightless owl of Cuba, quite large and sadly extinct. And then one more example. We all know caterpillars. They go munching leaves and they're herbivores. But not in Hawaii, at least not all of them.
Caterpillar.
All right, I gotta show you that again because you weren't ready. It says
Caterpillar.
a carnivorous caterpillar that preys on fruit flies. So there are plenty of examples around the world of exquisite adaptations, organisms presumably well adapted to their environment, sometimes not so well adapted, but no parallel anywhere else in the world. Why, then, we ask, might convergence occur in some places, convergence, and not in others? Well, one possibility is that a species is adapted to a unique environment that no other organism occupies, and so there's been no opportunity for any other organism to do this. Maybe koalas are an example like that, living in eucalyptus, eating the toxic leaves and so on. But that's probably not the common explanation. Another possibility is that there are different ways to produce the same function. Organisms that come up with the same way of dealing with a challenge posed by nature, but evolve different tools to do that. Consider, for example, woodpeckers. Now, I don't know how much you know about woodpecker lifestyle, but here's what woodpeckers do. They go tapping on dead wood, and what they're doing is they're listening for an echo of a hollow tube inside where there would be a wood-eating grub, boring its way through. When they hear the echo, then they go boom, 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 sledgehammer-like to drill in till they get to the tube, the burrow, and then out comes their really long tongue, so long it wraps around the back of their head, and it's covered with little barbs, and so the tongue snags the grub and pulls it out. And that's how woodpeckers get their sustenance. Woodpeckers are found on every continent except Australia and Antarctica, but they don't like to fly over water, so you don't find them on islands. So on the island of Madagascar, there are no woodpeckers, so another animal has adopted the woodpecker lifestyle, and that is the aye-aye, a type of lemur. And the way the aye-aye does its business, it has these big ears, a great sense of hearing. It's listening for the grubs, chewing away. When it hears one, well, let's watch this video to see what else it does.
Sharp incisors rip away the bark. Its bony middle finger changes roles from a scanner to a scraper. The aye-aye locks in. The finger transforms into a hook. A sharp fingernail impales the grub. It's dragged up, out, and into the aye-aye's mouth.
So, a face only a mother can love. But it's doing the same thing as the woodpecker. It's just using its long finger and its incisors instead of the tools that the woodpecker has. Why two such different adaptations to do the same thing? I'll come back to that in a moment. There's one other explanation. It's subtly different, and that is organisms not doing the same function in different ways, but meeting a challenge in different ways. So, for example, consider if the challenge is capturing fast-running prey on the Serengeti plains. Well, cheetahs do it by an incredible burst of speed. They outrun them and bring them down. Painted dogs aren't that fast, but they have incredible endurance, and they just run them to exhaustion. So they've come up with different functions and different adaptations to address the same challenge. Another example is nectar-eating birds. Hummingbirds and others I've talked about already. Long beak, they reach deep into the flower corolla to get the nectar at the bottom. But there are birds called nectar robbers who take a shortcut. They have a little hook on the end of their bill, and they just make a little cut at the bottom of the corolla, and then it's only this far to the nectar, and they stick their bill in and getting it. Again, different solutions to the challenge of getting the nectar. Well, the last question then is, if there are multiple ways to adapt, what determines which one will evolve? Well, one possibility is chance, as Sean was just telling us. It may just be that one species has a mutation that gives it one trait that's useful, where somewhere else a different mutation leads it down a different path. And so just pure chance could explain the difference. But another explanation is ancestry. Species selection works on what's already present. And so what has happened in the past constrains the path of evolution. Very important paper by the same person Sean talked about last time, Francois Jacob. That wasn't the same person. They worked together. Yes, I got confused for a second. Right. Anyway, his point was that natural selection does not work as an engineer works, by which he means it doesn't come up with a plan a priori and then implement it. Rather, it works like a tinkerer who works on what already exists, doing what it can with the materials at its disposal. In other words, tinkering with what's already there. Consider, for example, that most fast-swimming organisms swim by powering their swimming by their strong tails, either back side by side or up and down. But not the penguin. The penguin, quite a fast swimmer, does it with its forearms, flying through the water. Why didn't the penguin do it like other species? Well, it's probably relevant that birds lost their tails evolutionarily very early in their existence. So when penguin ancestors went back into the water, they had no tail to modify. Now, in theory, they could have just re-evolved a tail, but it was probably much easier to take the forelimbs already adapted for this motion and just adapt them for doing it in water instead of instead of the air. That's it, water instead of the air. The same explanation explains the eye and the woodpecker. Birds don't have teeth and they don't have fingers, so the eye mode of doing it was not available. Conversely, eyes have those tools, and so the evolutionary ancestry shapes them to evolve in different ways. Well, these points illustrate that Jacob was absolutely correct. If there were a creator at work, we wouldn't need to look at evolutionary history. There would be no evolutionary history, and it certainly wouldn't provide any understanding. But in fact, natural selection does work like a tinkerer, as it is modifying pre-existing structures into adaptive forms. What is amazing, I think, is that the way this works ends up producing organisms oftentimes so exquisitely adapted to their environments that we could imagine them being designed. But it is just the work of natural selection, and I think that's the marvel of the evolutionary process. So, thank you very much.